So we are live. Welcome to everyone. Welcome, welcome. We'll just give it a moment to start, but I wanted to give everyone the opportunity to get in. Yeah, we have a wonderful webinar today, so we were really looking forward to this topic. All right, so yeah, it's 4 o'clock now, so I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to FIU Cyber's International Content Expansion Series webinar. My name is Jillian Avendano, and I'm the Program Director for the Center for International Business Education and Research here at FIU. The Center for International Business Education and Research is a Title VI grant from the U.S. Department of Education with the main objective to promote U.S. competitiveness in international business and trade. And we're excited to bring to you today the topic, which is Back to the Future, the return of geopolitical risk in business. In this webinar, we will focus on key questions like exploring geopolitical risk in business. Why has geopolitical risk increased in the last decade? Is this a temporary or lasting reality? What factors make it difficult for businesses to manage geopolitical risks? What can companies do to better be prepared for to deal with geopolitical risks? We are lucky to have top experts with us in this field, and it's an honor for me to introduce our speakers. Before I get started, just wanted to mention that throughout the webinar, we invite you to pose your questions in the question and answer box. And at the end of the session, our speakers will try to address as many of those questions as possible. So our first speaker we have is Professor Edgardo Papacena, and he has over 35 years of global business experience. He's worked in over 50 countries throughout his career. As a senior partner in PwC, he held various executive leadership roles, including Global Chief Strategy and Business Model Officer, leading the firm's global strategy, strategic acquisitions and investments, brand positioning, business model transformation and innovation, and geopolitical risk management across 150 plus countries. He's advised multinational companies around the world, consulting with C-level executives in business strategy, business model innovation, business digital transformation, organizational strategy, change management, and mergers and acquisitions. He is currently CEO of Canny Investments, responsible for, and am I pronouncing that right, at Canny Investments? Yeah. Responsible for translating global macro trends into portfolio investment strategies and angel investing ventures in digital startups. He's also a senior advisor to private equity firms and private companies. His intellectual interests have led him to think critically about critical thinking and study how leaders need to evolve their strategic thinking and decision-making skills to deal with a complex environment shaped by the convergence of global trends in geopolitics, macroeconomics, and digitization. He is an adjunct professor of strategy and international business at Florida International University. His courses focus on helping executives develop critical strategic thinking skills by exploring global megatrends at the intersection of geopolitical, macroeconomic, and technological dynamics. He has consistently won the Best Professor and Best Course awards as students find his real-life teaching approach very relevant and to the business challenges they face in today's complex global environment. He obtained an MBA from the University of Chicago and completed postgraduate programs in global strategy, international economics, and global leadership at Harvard, MIT, and Stanford universities. Next, we have Dr. Stav Feinschmidt, and he is an associate professor and a Knight Ridder Eminent Scholar Chair in International Business at Florida International University's College of Business. His research examines institutions and governance organizational capabilities and methods in organizational research. His work appears in outlets such as the Journal of International Business Studies, Strategic Management Journal. Sorry, I wanted to put your pictures up there. Strategic Management Journal, Journal of Management Studies, Journal of World Business, and Organization Studies. Prior to joining FIU, Dr. Fainschmidt worked with Deloitte in auditing and consulting services. And without further ado, I pass it along to Dr. Fainschmidt and Professor Papasena.
Thank you very much, Jill. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, of course, to FIU Cyber for supporting this this session. And of course, Jill, thank you very much for coordinating and helping with setting everything up, and also for pronouncing my name so well, which not many people can do. So,
oh, good. Thank you both for joining us today. We're very lucky to hear from you both on this intriguing subject.
So a quick note about format. Edgardo and I discussed this kind of several options on how we can do it. And in the end, we thought that a good format for this would be something that resembles an interviewer-interviewee dynamic. Of course,
like Larry King.
Not quite of that quality, perhaps, but I will do my best. Of course, I will be the interviewer and you will be the interviewee naturally. And of course, that I will also share some of my own insights where relevant. It also means that we might go a little bit over the originally allotted time of 1 hour, but we will see how that goes. I'd like to start first with a quick note on why this topic is important to us. And I guess I'll go first. And
please.
Sure. So we're talking about geopolitical risk. As someone who does research in international business, what I noticed in our literature is that we have a pretty vibrant stream of research that deals with political risk and political uncertainty and how multinational companies deal with it, but actually not a whole lot on geopolitical risk. And I think some of the issues we will discuss today will actually be a reflection of why that has been the case in the last few decades. Of course, there's a lot of research on geopolitical risk in all kinds of disciplines, whether it's political science, international relations, and so on. A little bit less in international business. We do have good research on global value chains and the orchestration of global value chains, but not necessarily a geopolitical perspective on these global value chains. With that said, I think that it's clear that we're entering into this quasi-new reality where the success of multinational companies might require that we look at different things than we looked in the last 20, 30 years, perhaps, at least partially. And so I think it's important to now, I guess, think about the role of geopolitics in what multinational companies do or do not do or should do more seriously in international business research. So my approach obviously is very academic to it. I think your approach is a little bit different.
Yeah, actually, thank you, Stab. As Jill said before, I spent all my time in business for over 35 years. So I come to this field with a practitioner's perspective. I was lucky enough in my professional career to really be able to integrate some of my personal interests in global economics, political philosophy, history, into actually helping clients with their business strategies. And then as the chief strategy officer of PwC, doing that myself for the organization. PwC is a mini UN. It's a firm that has a presence in over 150 countries. So as a chief strategy officer, I was responsible not only for managing geopolitical risk, but doing deals with sitting at the other side of the table. I had government officials from China, Russia, India, the Philippines, Poland, Morocco. Just pick the country. Some friendly, some not so friendly. I will not go into the details of who was who. So in a sense, I cut my teeth in geopolitics by dealing with the reality, sometimes harsh reality of geopolitics, which is something I believe any business person, any investor needs to understand. It's not a field for the faint of heart. You really need to build a backbone to deal with some of these topics. So that's why now I try to teach some of those things at FIU. And as the CEO of my own investment company, I try to, in my investment strategies, I try to reflect some of the geopolitical realities of the world. So as Nassim Nicholas Taleb would say, I have skin in the game because I actually invest using some of my own geopolitical insights.
Fair enough. We kind of started talking directly about geopolitical risk. I think some different people might have a different understanding of what that is. I want us to make sure that we anchor the conversation in kind of around the same concept. So what is geopolitical risk, really?
Yeah, actually, I think that every person that she asked that question will have a very different answer, right? Yeah. So there's two words there, geopolitics and risk. Each of them has multiple interpretations. Geopolitics, really, from my perspective, deals with the a state dynamics and relations with the rest of the world, with other states. Often it relates to the projection of that state of power. I mean, power is always part of geopolitics. And whenever there's power, there's conflict. So the history of humankind has been a history of the rise and fall of great empires. And that is at the essence of geopolitics, right? So that's the traditional definition of geopolitics. Risk, for me, when I think of the word risk, I think of the word loss, right? If you think in the traditional geopolitical sense and you enter a war, so you may gain or lose territory, right? So that's the traditional definition of geopolitical risk. Best example is Russia's annexation of Crimea. I mean, that's a good example of loss for the Ukraine, gain for Russia. But it's also from a financial perspective, risk is the potential of losing the value of your portfolio in the stock market, or for a company losing the value of its assets or future returns. So for me, I always look at that from the perspective of loss. And so when you put them together, geopolitical risk, traditionally, we refer to geopolitical risk, the example I gave before, right? Crimea. Crimea is a clear example of what people would say geopolitical risk today. What China is doing in the South China Sea, what China is doing in Taiwan, what China is doing in Hong Kong. The beauty of today's world is that you have real life examples to understand what geopolitical risk means. This is not theory, it's happening, right? So that is a traditional view. My definition is broader because of the world, the way the world has changed over the last several decades. It's much more interdependent. We have technologies that states use to actually advance their objectives. They can advance their objectives through economic tools. Good example of that from a business perspective. In 2012, the government of Iran actually ran a cyber attack on the US financial system. Very few people know that if you're not in the financial services area, but brought down the websites of the New York Stock Exchange, JP Morgan, Bank of America, SunTrust, you name it, right? Is that geopolitical risk? You bet, right? What were they doing? They were kind of showing the US that they have capabilities to impair our financial system. They were not conquering territory, but they were projecting power through technology, right? Same thing happened. The largest shipping company in the world, Maersk, a Danish company, was paralyzed in 2017 when Russia attacked Ukraine through a malware called NotPetya. that also affected a number of other companies. So today, governments like states like China, Russia, Iran, the US, let's put it in the table, right? Also use technology in a manner that can have a significant impact on the stock market, on companies, right? But also sometimes domestic issues may create geopolitical risk in a manner that you may not, that traditionally we don't think of. Good example, good reality of today's world is the decision of shutting off the Keystone pipeline. Okay, that creates, from a national security perspective, a position for the U.S. that has become one of the most powerful energy countries in the world, achieving energy independence, puts the U.S. at a disadvantageous position with not so friendly countries such as Iran, Russia, Venezuela, who are taking advantage of the fact that the U.S. will shorten its supply of energy into the marketplace. When I say energy, I mean oil, I mean natural gas. So those decisions that are, in theory, domestic and political, as you said before, can very quickly have implications from a geopolitical perspective, because it alters the balance between different countries operating in a global environment. So that's really the way I look at geopolitical risk, with a very broad lens of how you can create conflict, or you can actually threaten a country's national security interest.
See, and you gave an example from 2012, I believe, right? So that suggests to me that geopolitical risk is not really news, right? So is it a new thing? Is it just heightened in the last decade or so? Is it something that has always? What is your perspective on kind of geopolitical risk as a new phenomena versus an old phenomena, or an old phenomena with new clothes on it, I guess?
So I could have used an example of 2012 BCE.
Okay.
Okay. Geopolitics is part of human nature. It's who we are. And we humans tend to be conflicted oftentimes, right? And we like to project power. Actually, when you look at the first two official history books of the Western civilization, the histories by Herodotus and the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides one is about the Greco-Persian War. The other one is the conflict between Athens and Sparta. So conflict, which is another word that you can use for geopolitics, has been with us all the time. What happens is that, as we will discuss later, all of those who are alive, and I assume that most of the people here in the audience were born 1945, but even if you were born between 1945 and you're in the audience, what I'm going to say applies. We get used to a Goldilocks world, where we grew up in business, especially, without exposure to a geopolitical risk. Okay, that changed completely in the last 10 years, but we get used to that, right? So all of a sudden, we find that there's new rules of the game, and we panic. And that's what many companies have been doing for the longest time. And I tell you, geopolitical risk is at the center of the rise and fall of many financial empires. When you look at the history of the stock exchanges, the New York Stock Exchange became the most important stock exchange in the world, as a consequence of the fall of the London Stock Exchange in the First World War. And London became the most important as a consequence of the fall of the Amsterdam Exchange in the war between the Netherlands and Britain. So that tells you there's also opportunities, not only risk, right? Many people have made tons of money. Ask George Soros, right? Who in 1992 broke the Bank of England by shorting the British pound, and in the process made $1 billion, right? So he took advantage of the capitalist system that he likes to complain about so much, right? So if you're smart enough, you can actually make some good money by looking at how geopolitics are impacting the real business world.
So it sounds to me, if I were to distill that to kind of an overarching pattern, is that geopolitical risk has always been there. So
Mhm.
it's not necessarily something new, which is kind of why we chose the title of the session to be what it is. So it's always there, but it sounds to me like the intensity and the nature of the geopolitical risk changes over time. So it can ebb and flow over time, but also from a qualitative standpoint, it can be different, not only more intense, but also different. So that suggests that um, at least a little bit of a historical perspective on it can be helpful, not for the sake of just knowing history, but actually because there are parallels between different times. So can you perhaps kind of briefly, as briefly as possible, kind of walk us through some of the key periods that we should distinguish and think about when we think about the current geopolitical risk in a historical perspective?
Yeah. So basically, what you said is absolutely right. I mean, that's it's like a tide. It flows and it comes and goes. I would say that maybe, again, all of us who have been in the business world for the last 30 years have lived in the exception of that process. Okay, throughout most of history, we have had geopolitical risk, and now all of a sudden, it's like you've always been watching American football, and now all of a sudden you have to watch soccer. There are different rules of the game, right? And you don't know how to adjust to that process. So, and that's what business executives actually are dealing with, right? All of a sudden, they took advantage. Most companies since the year 2000 approximately have taken advantage of a world that the US pretty much controlled unilaterally and an aggressive process of globalization. And that really has driven all of those periods. So whenever you look at geopolitical risk, you have to look at the convergence of how the geopolitical environment and the globalization environment are working, right? So to give you a summary of where I would start with the geopolitical view is 1945, okay? For a simple reason, that was the end of the war, the Second World War. The foundations of the system that we know today, organizations like the UN, like the International Monetary Fund, like the World Bank, like the World Trade Organization, were actually created in 1945 as a mechanism to really restore the world. That was a period where we created a fairly stable geopolitical environment as a consequence of all of these multilateral institutions. And it was a period where in architecting those institutions from a geopolitical perspective, we architected a system of globalization that was very good. And when I say very good, one of the issues with globalization is that when you globalize, you have to, it's a strategy. Do you prioritize the international order or do you prioritize the domestic order? When you offshore works, when you send jobs offshore, you're prioritizing the international over the national, right? In that period, which I believe should be a good example for the future, what we need now, what we created is a fairly balanced globalization system where, yes, we wanted to have free trade. We wanted to create more international flows, but respecting the rights of each individual nation, each individual state, in terms of prioritizing domestic issues around employment, around security, those kinds of things. Anyone who really wants to understand this topic, I recommend one of the best books is by Danny Roderick, The Globalization Paradox. Is exceptional and explains all of this process that I'm trying to summarize in a few minutes here. So the world created a very nice combination of geopolitical stability and institutional stability and a benign, moderate globalization process. Now, this was the period of the Cold War. So many people will say, how can you say that when we had nuclear heads pointing at each other throughout all of this period? Well, actually, that was called the bipolar world because it was the US versus the Soviet Union, it was a good thing when you have a balance of power, because you check each other in terms of how much you can advance your agenda. And actually, it was the reason why we never had a war is precisely that the US and the Soviet Union knew that they couldn't afford to go into war. Actually, we had many more wars after the Cold War than before the Cold War. Okay, so that was the period until I would say 1989, which is when the Berlin Wall fell, communism fell, the Soviet Union disintegrated, and the US became what it's called the unipolar power, the only relevant power that called the shots in the world, that called the shots politically, economically, financially, geopolitically, militarily. The US called the shots. Okay, many of us were alive in that period, so we remember what that was. The issue there was that, along with that, we created what Roderick in his book calls hyperglobalization, a globalization process where we prioritize the importance of the global economy over the national economy. Okay, and that process, I mean, that was a process that created global value chains that allowed China to enter the World Trade Organization, and many of the things that actually was a ferocious, a very aggressive hyperglobalization process that resulted in a few winners and many losers. Okay, there was a study by the McKinsey Global Institute a couple of years ago that showed that the advanced economies, they looked at whether the income of working population in advanced economies in 25 countries remained flat or stagnant or declined over that period, and 75% of the working population in the advanced economies, I'm talking about the US, the UK, France, Italy, experience losses in their income power. So that created the basis of many of the bases of the inequalities that we talk about today. Clear winners, clear losers, and that delivered eventually what many of us remember, which is the 2008 global financial crisis. Right?
I was about to bring that
up.
up.
And you know that when there's a saying that when the tide goes out, you learn who was swimming naked. And many economies around the world were swimming naked. And that's when the central banks had to put tremendous amount of money into the economy. So it created a very imbalanced, unstable global economy. So that takes you to the global financial crisis. So let me stop there to get your any reactions or any comments that you had. So I got to 2008, from 1945 to 2008 in 5 minutes. Yes. Okay, so yeah, I tried to be fast.
That's pretty good progress, I would say. It sounds to me like you kind of start with essentially a bipolar geopolitical reality that then switches to a unipolar geopolitical reality, and now we're back to a bipolar political reality. And you allude to China being the other polar, right? The other pole, I guess. And so the issue here is that if I can distill what you said, is that most executives nowadays kind of grew up in a world that was unipolar, and so their entire approach to value chain strategy, whatever it is with the underlying bedrock of a unipolar geopolitical reality. Whereas right now we're already or maybe on the verge of a bipolar geopolitical reality, and that's a problem for many companies because it's just not a natural way of doing business or thinking about business for them. Would that be a?
I would absolutely right. I mean, I would say that a significant portion of business people, executives in the business world today who have some senior position, leadership position in multinational companies, in investment companies, grew up professionally in that period. So they grew up professionally in a world where, since it was a unipolar world, the US called all the shots, there was no geopolitical conflict by definition, right? Since it was a world where globalization was driving the economy, all that you had to do is ride the horse of globalization, and you would build the global value chains. So what happens when after 2008, globalization starts declining, slowing? I mean, today, one of the words that many companies or many publications use is deglobalization, right? We are going back in terms of globalization. What happens in a world where the US no longer calls the shots, where the global institutions that we created in 1945, the IMF, the UN, are no longer capable of dealing with the issues of the day? I mean, those were great institutions for 1945. They are obsolete institutions. Let's say things the way they are, obsolete institutions for today's world. I mean, we don't drive cars with 1945 technologies, right? We don't choose computers with 1945 technologies. We try to run a world order, which doesn't exist by definition, with those institutions. So again, we grew up in that world where the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the IMF would make all the decisions. On top of those two significant shifts, we have a third one, which is technology. Unlike any other period before, digital technologies is fundamentally transforming everything, everything. Business, work, warfare, you know, the examples I gave you before in terms of cyber warfare, cyber theft. So digital technologies is a third force that executives and business people and investors have to deal with. So all of a sudden, you're dealing with three fundamentally different forces. You know, that's what in science it's called paradigm shifts in economics, in geopolitics, in technology, and we don't know how to react. So the best analogy I would give to simplify that situation is, in geology, you know that there are tectonic plates moving, but you cannot tell when they're going to collide. When do you know? When there's an earthquake. Right. So today, when we hear all the noise around geopolitical conflicts, around issues, each of those are the individual earthquakes, right? Now, what companies learn in geology is, what we learn in geology is build infrastructure that can handle, has the flexibility and the resilience to actually handle those earthquakes. The best example now with the pandemic is, look at what happened with the global value chains. They had absolutely no flexibility, no resilience to deal with the pandemic. And by the way, I haven't mentioned the pandemic here, because now all of a sudden people think that, you know, the pandemic is, everything happens because of the pandemic. The pandemic only accelerated the trends that we had in place. That's it. Didn't change anything. The pandemic did not change anything. Accelerated the multipolar world that we're living in, accelerated the decline of globalization, accelerated the adoption of business models, digital business models. So those are the kinds of things that really have brought us to where we are today. So to your point, executives find themselves in it's like, you know, if you remember the Wizard of Oz, when she gets there and she says, we're not in Kansas anymore. Well, we're not in Kansas anymore, right? And what's this Oz world? Well, that's a world in which we have to live. So one of the questions that we posed in the flyer was, is geopolitical risk temporary or permanent? I tell you, it's here to stay, as it has been here to stay throughout humankind, except for the 50 years, the Goldilocks years, where, you know, the US could run the world, where globalization really allowed us to get to where we are today. It's a reality that those companies and those executives and those investors who understand the essence of geopolitical risk will have a significant advantage in the future.
So I can see now the kind of I guess the uniqueness of the period that we're, I guess, already in,
Yeah.
or entering.
We have been here for the last 10 years.
Right.
Now it's become more evident. The earthquakes are more frequent.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
And like you said, there's these three forces, and I can also see how the forces interact with each other.
Right.
Technology plus a bipolar world suggests that states are going to use technology for all kinds of statecraft and cyber warfare and stuff like that. And companies get caught up in the middle of these things all the time. We're going to talk a little bit later about what companies can actually do about it, right? But before that, kind of a more fundamental thing that strikes me is that, okay, geopolitical risk. It's a risk. I mean, it's companies face many risks. What do? They address those risks, hopefully, right? Maybe not all of them, but companies face all kinds of risks. They address them. And I guess from what we're seeing in reality is that companies are just not very good at it. Some of it, like you said, has to do with the kind of a sort of imprinting of what executives grew up knowing about the world. But even so, I guess if it were easy to address geopolitical risk or bake geopolitical risk into your business model or your value chains, then companies would do it. But they don't. So my question is, why is it so difficult to manage geopolitical risk? I guess in your analogy, why is it so difficult to know when the plates are going to hit each other?
You should ask the geologists. They don't know.
That's a different department.
Right? They don't know. It's a good analogy because it's exactly like that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know when they're going to hit each other,
right?
But you can do things to prepare. That's the main difference. So even we use the word manage geopolitical risk. In reality, you cannot manage geopolitical risk. What you can do if you plan properly is you can mitigate the consequences of geopolitical risk, which is a very different thing. So actually, to support what you just said, Stav, there was recently, McKinsey conducted a study of executives all over the world, because this is a reality all over the world, where they asked, what are the major risks to your company's growth and how well prepared you are to handle them. At the very top, it was always geopolitical risk, whether it was trade conflict, whether it was global value chains.
Right.
Geopolitical risks was at the very top. Guess what? That was the one area where companies pretty much, like I said before, dropped the ball, and they were not even prepared to handle that.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is why?
Why?
Right? Why? Risk management has traditionally been approached with a financial perspective. So you quantify, right? What is the probability of losing X in the marketplace, right? Well, let me tell you something. Geopolitical risk cannot be quantified. That's the first problem, right? I mean, risk is a formula. The probability of something happening times the impact of something, of that risk. Let me give you the example I said before. What is the probability that China will invade Taiwan? We don't know. You can't set a probability, right, to that question.
I mean, you can. The question is how reliable that probability
is. And you can
is.
say it's somewhere between 1% and 99%.
It might be akin more to geopolitical uncertainty then, rather than geopolitical risk.
So, but that's a point. Yeah. Probability-wise, it's uncertain. Impact-wise, so let's say that there's a war between China and Taiwan. Will not be Taiwan. Would be the U.S. Would be a number of other allies, right? Well, Taiwan, let me remind you, manufactures 64% of the manufacturing chips in the world. So that means that every single industry, whether it's auto manufacturing, whether it's plane manufacturing, whether it's computers, will be impacted by that. So how do you quantify the impact of that? So the issue there is you have uncertainty both in the probability and the impact. Okay, so I'll come back later and say how you can deal with that. There are ways of dealing with that issue. So that's one thing. The second one is, it's interesting, I used to teach this concept for many years in my class, and students never got it until the coronavirus pandemic occurred, which is a black swan. Okay, so now everyone, I don't have to explain to anybody what a black swan is an event with a very low probability, with a huge impact, right? Well, most really important geopolitical risks are black swans by definition. Okay, so again, it's extremely difficult to envision that. There's also something that the way that traditionally, whether it's financial or operational risk, we look at an event, right? So what happens if I have assets in Colombia and the Colombian peso devalues? So you can set different scenarios there, and there's a number there. So you look at the event. In geopolitics, you can't look at event. You have to look at trends, and very few people look at trends. Let me give you an example of that. You've heard for the last 10 years all kinds of debates as to what the US should do with NATO, what the US should do in the Middle East. Should we pull, irrespective of the government, right? Should we pull troops back? Well, all of those issues are looking at one event, NATO, Middle East, missing the major factor, which is both NATO and Middle East are geopolitical issues of the 20th century. We're in the 21st century. The geopolitical issue, the geopolitical area of the 21st century is called the Indo-Pacific. So when we talk about, India, when we talk about the South China Sea, when we talk about Australia, so clearly what the US needs to do, we all learn in strategy that you have to, there are trade-offs, right? So one of the things there is to actually look at those issues, forget the event, and look at the trends. And the trends are around the three areas that we discussed before: economics, geopolitical changes, or technological changes. So that's another factor that makes it very difficult for people to look at that. So what companies do is they usually rely on experts, right? Geopolitical experts. And we've already had our fair share of experts in the last several months. But in the case of geopolitical or political experts, I don't have to tell you what happened with Brexit. Less than 10% of the polls were right, or what happened in the US, right? What happened with economists' forecasts as to how the economy is going to grow. Oftentimes, companies outsource the geopolitical risk analysis to people who don't understand well their industry, their company, because geopolitical risk is always sector specific. Okay, very different. If there are issues in the South China Sea today, there's a huge difference if you are in the oil industry or if you're in the retail industry. And that's where experts really have had a difficult time making the connection between how to translate ideas and concepts to the reality of each individual business. Let me give you an example from my own personal experience after the 2008 financial crisis. In PwC, a company that operates in the business of accounting, taxes, our major issue was how much regulation will the authorities bring into the industry. And our number one geopolitical risk area was the European Union. It was not China, was not India, was not Russia, because the European Union wanted to decouple from the US from a regulatory perspective and create, and create a separate regulatory environment from the one in the US. So that's some of the technical factors that make geopolitical risk. And so as companies design their geopolitical strategy, they have to take into account some of these factors to actually counter some of those problems.
So, I mean, some of it is technical, but from what you described, it sounds like some of the difficulties in, I guess, pinpointing geopolitical risk or preparing for it are not just technical, right? It sounds like there's like an organizational difficulty. It sounds like there's even some, going back to your point about, these executives grew up in an era where there was really no bipolar geopolitical reality. So it sounds like there's also kind of a cognitive kind of a barrier that it's just not baked into how executives think. It's not baked into how companies are organized. It's just goes against, I guess, kind of some of the kind of core assumptions that are driving decisions, right? So even if you could quantify it, right, it might still not make it to be kind of a core part of a company's strategy, right?
When you look at the way companies typically develop strategy, very rarely do companies bake risk management, I would say in general, into strategy, right? They come up with a strategy, and then after you have a strategy, you say, well, let's implement it. In the implementation, let's deal with risk. Very, very few companies actually analyze, even from an investment perspective, analyze geopolitical risk into that. Best example is the one I mentioned before, global value chains. Look at the pharma industry. 80% of the industry depends on China. Okay, why? Because the strategic priority was to be efficient, to reduce costs, not to create flexibility and resilience if something were to happen. The chip manufacturing industry. How is it possible that one country has 64 of the manufacturing? So from a strategic perspective, as part of this hyper-globalization process where we could create a global value chain anywhere, and the global internet allowed us to actually to make that happen, we said, I want to minimize my costs. I want to be super efficient. I want to be super productive. We never thought of what if one of these risks actually kick in. So clearly, companies haven't traditionally created strategies baking risk management and geopolitical risk into the analysis. Something else that you're old enough to remember this. Remember the days when companies had country managers, right? I had a country manager in Egypt. I had a country manager in Sweden. I had a country manager in Spain. Now companies, with this globalization, everything is global. So sometimes you may have a regional area, but imagine if you're the guy in charge of Europe, Middle East, and Africa, right? How much would you know of what happens on the ground, right? Let me give you a real example that's happening right now, and I bet very few people know. And if you're a multinational doing business in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe, you should be looking at this. There's a serious potential of a war between Egypt and Ethiopia, okay, around the what's called the Grand Renaissance Dam, which is where the Nile starts. Yeah. Okay, the Nile starts in Ethiopia and runs downstream all the way to Egypt. Well, as you know, for the last 5,000 years, the entire economy of Egypt revolves around the Nile. Okay, once that Ethiopia actually builds a dam and fills up the dam, that will reduce the supply of fresh water into Egypt for at least 60-70%. So Sudan, and between Egypt and Ethiopia, you have Sudan. Okay, so there are the three countries through which the Nile goes. Egypt and Sudan have already been doing air exercises together with the purpose of actually bombing the dam once it's filled. Okay, if that were to happen, not only do we have a major crisis in Africa. Remember what happened a few weeks ago with the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal? Sure. Well, Egypt controls the Suez Canal. Yeah. So global trade flow will stop. Okay. Now, how many people talk about that? How many companies actually talk about that? If you have a country manager in Egypt, you bet that that guy better know that that's an issue, right? So that's the other problem. As we globalize the companies, there isn't anyone close to the ground to really understand what's happening and the geopolitical implications for the company and for the sector and for the economy. So I could go through a number of other examples, but these are you can tell that there's something in the way that organizations have not been structured, both in terms structured, strategy, and process. Those three elements have not been created to deal with this uncertainty, because they were built mostly for that ideal world when geopolitical risk did not exist.
So I think that's a pretty good segue for us into kind of asking what can companies actually do about it, right? I think you alluded to a couple of things. There's seems to be an issue with how GVCs are designed. There also seems to be an issue with how the structures themselves, corporate structures are designed. There seems to be an issue with how managers think about some of these things. So of course, probably the list of what companies can do is very long, right? Maybe give us kind of the three, in your opinion, the three kind of most impactful, most powerful things that companies can do concretely in this new reality.
So maybe I can tell you, since I was in charge of that for PwC, and I actually built a global business model, I can tell you what I did. I think that's more credible than what the books say, right?
Go for it.
That's actually what I did.
That's why we're here.
So I mentioned the idea of scenario thinking. Okay, it's extremely important when you think of the future. When it comes to geopolitics, the word should be futures, should not be future. You also always need to look at a number of different options. And that's what scenario thinking does. Okay, so after the global financial crisis, as I mentioned to you, our number one concern was what would the EU do? So we went into a very heavy exercise of looking at, what are the potential scenarios and how can we prepare for each of those different scenarios? I'm not saying that scenario one will be 20% probable, scenario two will be 30%. Any of them could be probable, and I have to prepare for that. Let me put that in the context of the example I gave you before. So one of the things I do, I have created right now a scenario exercise for myself on the China-Taiwan situation, because I believe that's the single most important geopolitical risk that the world is facing. Okay, so the way I look at that is I look at that in terms of, there's two uncertainties. How aggressive will China be? So at one side would be China will continue with air raids, right? Will continue just flying planes around Taiwan to show them that they can do it, or they can go all the way and actually invade Taiwan. Those are two very different worlds, right?
Yeah.
Now, then on top of that is how will the rest of the world react? If the world says we'll impose very severe economic sanctions on China, it's a very different world from the one where the US and the allies in the area, they are Japan, Australia, Singapore, decide to actually support Taiwan. That's direct war. So there I just painted for you.
Right.
There's four scenarios.
Do you think that in situations like this, that one of the reasons that managers or executives don't think about these kind of scenarios because they're just so extreme and so kind of, I don't know, scary that it's kind of something that they might be aware of, kind of in a logical way that they could envision it, but it's just so extreme that it just doesn't get into the conversation?
I think it's a connection of things. It's number one, and it's okay. I mean, most business people don't have a geopolitical education.
Right.
Okay. You have to understand history. You have to understand economics. You have to understand geography. Okay. I hope that in FIU we teach that now. Okay?
Right.
We're one of the few schools that actually teaches that right now. So the executives are not prepared. They rely on experts that give them a very biased perspective, in my opinion. And then they rely on the media,
right,
that actually inflates stories that should not be inflated. Okay, so instead of focusing on the trend, what's happening, they focus on the event. Okay, a fleet of Chinese ships has gone to Taiwan. Well, that's the event. But what is the broader picture? So it's a combination of things, Stab, where it's not just the way that executives think is a problem, yes, but it's not only their fault. There's many contextual factors that take them there, right?
The entire practice is
that's why scenario thinking is a way. It's a practice that we also teach that in our programs, because I think it's one of the core skills that executives will have to have for the future. So I gave you one there. The second one is we designed a global value chain. PwC is a professional services organization. We don't sell nuts and bolts. We sell services. So instead of factories, we have service centers.
Mm.
Okay. Many companies, what have done is India has an unlimited supply of professionals who speak English, have good technology skills, and are significantly less expensive than the US. So many companies have concentrated all their resources in one country. Okay. What we did is that's very efficient. That's the equivalent of the pharma industry building. So what we did is, knowing it would be more expensive, we actually diversified our assets. And that's why I said before I had to negotiate with the government of Russia, China, the Philippines, India, Poland, Morocco, Argentina. We built service delivery centers in many places so that I would have the flexibility. If something happened to one of the delivery centers, I will be able to move work somewhere else, right? That's what companies are trying to do now, trying to move to regional value chains, right? Decouple value chains.
Yeah.
But so if you think of this from the get-go, you design it properly to build flexibility and resilience into the
So I
value
guess
chain.
it introduces some kind of a redundancy into
Yes.
your global
Yes,
structure.
it's more expensive.
But and you know, that might mean something for your efficiency vis-a-vis competitors. But what you're saying is that in today's reality and in the long term, it actually makes sense.
Absolutely. The other thing is, I mentioned to you before that, in my opinion, you cannot manage geopolitical risk, but you can mitigate the risks. One of the important things is when you think ahead of what may happen, how do you translate that operationally into your how you translate that into your operations so that when things happen, when the earthquake occurs, you do have protocols and you have procedures to deal with that. Okay, so in our case, what we did is we built very specific disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans in the event that something will happen. And it's not only geopolitical risk. I mean, I had delivery centers in the Philippines, in India, where you have typhoons and you have all kinds of storms. What happens if a hurricane or a typhoon hits one of your factories, one of your centers? Then you have to have mechanisms to actually very quickly recover and be able to move into another. So there's a number of different things that companies, when you think ahead of time, you can actually create mechanisms to think differently and to start creating protocols for mitigating those types of risks.
Got it. I want to maybe switch the focus, similar question, but switch the focus to a bit of a higher level, right? We asked what can companies do? Let me ask you on a much broader scale. What does the world need in terms of global institutions in a reality that is geopolitically bipolar, or whatever it is we end up with, multipolar, or who knows, right? Or no poles at all.
So let's start there. Actually, that's a good, because actually you hear everything. So during the Cold War, it was clearly bipolar.
Yes.
No doubts. After that was clearly unipolar. Okay. So what are we right now? Right. Some people have used the expression G0. Right. No one is really calling the shots. I think that's where we are today, pretty much.
Yeah.
Now, where will we go? Many people say multipolar, meaning that there's a number of different major powers, great powers, calling the shots. My bet is that it will be bipolar, as it's becoming between the US and China.
Yeah.
And in the old days of the Cold War, the world was aligned between the Western Bloc and the Soviet bloc. And then you had the non-aligned countries, remember? I mean, you're old enough to remember that.
Yes.
Right? So now we will have the same thing. Now the alignment will be around economic and technology standards. That's why technology is such a major factor in shaping the future of the world. My bet is that we have to go back. If you ask me what I would like to, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I can tell you what I would like to see. I would like to see a world more like the one we created in 1945. That's why it's important to understand that. Okay, institutions for the right institutions for the right time. Okay, the IMF was the right institution for 1945. It's no longer the right institution. NATO was the right security alliance when we had a Cold War. What do you do when you have a Cold War with NATO? That's the fundamental debate, right? So institutions where you can actually debate these issues and that actually have some power to enforce the rules. And that's why the important thing is actually creating a handful, not very many, a handful of rules around economics, financial, and technology. And guess what? If we end up with 2 sets of standards, it's better than 10, right? I think that's where we will go. Look at the internet. The internet, one of the reasons why we were able to really drive globalization and global value chains is there was something called the global internet. The internet will no longer be global. There will be an American internet and there will be a Chinese internet. And the Europeans will have to decide which of those 2 standards they adopt. So those are some of the issues that need to be debated. Unfortunately, you don't see many of these things covered in the media these days. And those are the kinds of, the education that you need to provide to executives to let them, to get them to think in terms of the broad trends that will impact their business.
Well, I was actually going to go to that next, but just to highlight kind of the point that you made that the reason going back to the title of the session, right, the return of and back to the future, is that we can actually learn a lot from the geopolitical reality that existed from 45 onwards. And we can learn from not necessarily in the sense of what worked, but also from a comparative stance of why it worked and why it doesn't work now. Right. And what kinds of institutions we might need today that fit our reality. And also just understanding how a bipolar worked at the time. Some of the dynamics still transfer to what we see and will continue to see, because like you said, that bipolarity, US-China is not going anywhere. It's here to stay, right? So
the fundamental difference between that period and today is technology is much more important. When I say technology, I mean technology standards, right? Because digital technologies can be used for cyber warfare.
Sure.
Okay, who regulates what you can do and what you cannot do, right? How do you prevent cyber theft, cyber attacks? So I think that yes, 1945. Look at if you were to look at the institutions we have today, how well prepared are they to deal with these technological issues? They're not very well. They have no idea. They have no idea. So that, I would say, the philosophical mindset of how we build the world after the Second World War. This is not a Third World War, but if you're not careful, we could end up there.
So we talked about the global institutional system. We talked about firms. Let's go one step lower, actually, to the individual manager, executive. And some of our attendees here themselves might be wondering how, in this new reality, in this new business landscape, how do I become a geopolitically savvy business professional, executive manager?
Yes.
Whatever it is, what kind of kind of 1 or 2 concrete points of advice do you have for those?
I mean, actually, some of the questions I'm looking at we have received here. There's a number of questions that ask. I get all kinds of geopolitical analysis and forecasts. How do I determine the good, the bad, and the ugly? Right? I mean, that's what an executive, because we are inundated, flooded with reports and with studies. I would say look for a couple of different things. First of all, what I said before, does the forecast present one future or multiple futures? Okay, so you need to really understand that when you deal with uncertainty, you cannot look at one point that has 60% of probability of occurring. You don't know. So the first thing is good geopolitical forecasts present a number of scenarios or a range of probabilities. Then the other thing that I always look at is, do the geopolitical forecasts give you what I call signposts? Things that you need to monitor, that if these things occur, we will have a greater risk of an event taking place. In the example I gave you before in 2008, when I was looking at how after the financial crisis, regulation would evolve in different parts of the world, one of the signposts that we created is number of financial statements, restatements as a result of an accounting crisis. We knew that if that were to occur, the regulatory reaction would be drastic. So again, it's very context specific, industry specific, but so scenarios and their signposts. What kinds of things do I want to look at? The other thing that I always say is look at the more interdisciplinary the forecast is, the better. Okay, so for example, a country I know fairly well is India. And many people ask me, how will AI, artificial intelligence, impact India? To really understand that, you have to look at the economic, the geopolitical, the technological side. India has been able, it's a country that will soon become the most populous countries in the world. There's a million Indians entering the workforce every month, okay? So one thing that India cannot afford to have is unemployment. Or greater unemployment, I should say. When the main growth of India in the last decade has been around information technology, call centers, digital technologies, what happens if multinational companies decide to replace all of those workers with artificial intelligence, with machine learning? So I would expect that India will significantly slow down the adoption of artificial intelligence in their own country. So to actually look at that scenario, you have to have some understanding of the demographics of India, the economics of the industry, the technological potential of artificial intelligence. So there's a number of different disciplines that come together to actually give you a picture of the world.
Yeah.
And then the other one, I would say, facts and data. Facts and data are the forecast and the analysis based on the opinion, which is always in today's world, very ideologically biased, unfortunately, of whoever creates that report, or what are the facts? What's the data? And we have so much data today that properly analyzed and properly monitored, I think can make a big difference for executives to really make sense of geopolitical situations.
So I want to actually close on that point because I think that's very important. So again, on the same question of if I want to be a geopolitically savvy, a geopolitically informed professional and executive, and how I presume that opinion pieces or mainstream media pieces are going to be somewhat lacking in some of the aspects that you described. So presuming that people might not have the time or maybe even the willingness to actually go get data and do analysis, where would they get good information about geopolitics and geopolitical trends in a way that, I guess, from high quality, trustworthy sources that can shape their geopolitical thinking, I guess, in a strong, solid manner?
So you're right that mainstream media doesn't cover these things, okay? That would be a case of a misinformation. It's even worse. When they cover it, it's usually biased. It's disinformation, right? So certainly I would not rely on any sort of mainstream media. One of the things I always tell my clients is look at the source, right? If you receive a report from an insurance company giving you a picture of the world, chances are that report will be created in such a manner that will force you to buy insurance from that company. Or if you get from a geopolitical consultant to get a report to get consulting advice from another company. I usually tend to look at, personally myself, I have, over the last 10 years, I have canceled many subscriptions I used to have because I don't find them relevant anymore. So what I do is there's a couple of sources I trust. I don't think it's appropriate for me to to advertise those here,
Yeah.
right? But these sources do not make money in any other way. Okay, you subscribe to their services, and what you buy is their opinion, their advice, their facts. Okay, sources that bring to the table, help you understand the history. For example, if one of the things I mentioned before, to understand the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, you would have to have some history. So does the opinion give you that perspective is truly a multidisciplinary? Does it give you a broader aspect to that? There's a number of think tanks which are very good, which produce different pieces. Sometimes think tanks tend to be somewhat biased. So one of the things I say is try to look at a number of different sources, not just rely on one, a number of different sources, and make your own opinion. Okay. For me, the way that you think about the problem, how you think about the problem, is more important than the specific conclusion that you get to. But there's a certain degree of what I call information hygiene. Always be skeptical about what you read. Look at the sources. Look at who wrote it. Where did that guy work in the past? Does that guy have any sort of ideological bias? Unfortunately, we need to be, in today's world, we need to be much more careful, much more skeptical about how to read that information.
And I presume, just looking at some of the questions that we have in the chat, I think it's wise not to name the sources here, but I presume that if somebody reaches out to you
Yes.
Privately, you will be able to
I will
share.
tell them what I read.
You will be you will share your information hygiene,
yes.
your diet, right?
With them. I deal with my students all the time. Actually, they can tell by what I have them read in the case of my students. But I'll be more than glad to, if there's anyone out there who really needs some guidance, to provide some reference and by the way, the interesting thing is that many of these sources you don't have to pay for. They're free. A few are, you need a subscription, which are not very expensive, but that's usually the way that I go about it.
Yeah. So
there's a commercial hygiene that we have to respect in webinars of this nature.
So of course, if somebody wants to further discuss investment issues or information hygiene issues, they're welcome to reach out.
Absolutely.
We can talk about it offline.
Or they can sign up for your course or my course.
Well,
where we teach these things.
Yeah, right. That would be ideal, but not necessary to speak to us. Of course, we're actually very easy to find.
That's an infomercial.
Yes, fair enough. So I think we're, I don't know, Jill, are we, I think we're kind of out of time, right? We did go about 11 minutes early, but we started a few minutes late. So in Miami time, we are perfectly on time. So I think this is a pretty good point to wrap up.
So what some of the questions here is if they can have our emails.
Oh, we're very easy to find on the FIU website, actually.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Or Jill, we can.
Yeah, if you'd like, I can add it in the chat.
Yep.
Okay, let me go ahead and do that now. And then there was someone who asked about the book that you mentioned in the beginning.
Well, I was careful enough to actually mention one book, and the book I mentioned was The Globalization Paradox by Danny Roderick. It's a book written around 2011, but it's extremely relevant. It gives you the history of how we got to where we got here. And I can provide many other references for example, if you really want to understand some issues around China, I would recommend a couple of books. One is called Destined to War by Alison Graham. And the other one is the 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury.
Yeah, and of course, Roderick also has quite a few works that are relevant on, including some on second best institutions. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So, but yeah, I mean, for those, I guess the takeaway from this is that this is not geopolitical risk is not an abyss that we find ourselves in. You can actually be geopolitically informed and savvy if you read the right things and think about it in a more serious manner.
Listen, I have a degree in you know, my basic degree was economics and accounting. Then I got my MBA. I have no political philosophy background. So, I mean, it's really the interest in learning history and connecting the dots.
So it seems like the screen is frozen, but I don't know if everybody can still hear us. Oh, okay,
they can hear us.
So I think only Jillian is frozen, which is interesting because she's the host of the session. So
okay,
I think
so. What I was saying is that actually, the worst thing that you can do is go and get a degree in geopolitics. They don't exist. And geopolitics, as you could see in this conversation, you need to have some understanding of history, of geography, of economics, of political philosophy. You know, one of the things that we teach in our classes is always the concept of connecting the dots, thinking critically, bringing different ideas into the analysis. So it's intellectual curiosity is the best recipe for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm frozen, but you guys look great.
So it looks. I think this is a good point for us to end the session. But I mean, we have been talking about geopolitics for a very long time, and we're happy to talk with anybody else who's interested.
Yes,
outside of the session. And once again, thank you everybody for joining, for your questions, for being interested in geopolitics. And of course, thank you again to Jillian and FIU Cyber for supporting this session. And we will have many more sessions of this nature.
And I think maybe as a concluding message is for those of you who are in the business world or in the investment world, there are things that you can do, as I explained before. I mean, this is not, it's really a very different world. So for those of you who were playing American football, get used to playing soccer. Okay, you need to learn the rules of soccer. You play with different strategies, with different rules. So that's what really, and that's, by the way, is a reality that, especially for those of you who are younger in your mid-30s, it's a reality that you will have to live with for the rest of your professional careers. You know, reinvent yourself every 5 years.
Yeah.
So thank you for your attention, and clearly you and I enjoyed it. I mean, I don't know if they enjoyed the conversation. So
I don't know. Actually, which reminds me, please fill out the quick poll that Jillian posted here. I don't know if you did, but if not, please go ahead and
reach out to us. You know, any information that you need, we'll be more than glad to give you further guidance.
And otherwise, stay geopolitically savvy.
Yes. Bye-bye. Thank you.